They looked larger than life, dominant, powerful, untouchable. But what if I told you? Many of Hollywood's biggest legends were actually shorter than the average man, and the studios worked overtime to hide it. From hidden platforms to carefully chosen co-stars, an entire illusion was built to protect their image. Tonight, we're exposing 15 Golden Age actors whose real height might completely change how you see them. And one of them fooled everyone. Elisha Cook Jr., 5 feet 5 inches. He wasn't meant to dominate the screen, and that's exactly why he stood out. In films like The Maltese Falcon, Elisha Cook Jr. often played nervous, fragile, or desperate characters, men who felt like they were already losing before the scene even began. But part of that effect wasn't just acting, it was physical. At around 5'5", he was noticeably smaller than the men around him. Directors leaned into that. They framed him lower, surrounded him with taller actors, let his size visually reinforce vulnerability. But here's what's interesting. In an era obsessed with powerful, commanding male leads, Cook carved out a career by doing the opposite. He didn't need to appear larger than life. He made small feel real. And in a world built on illusion, that honesty made him unforgettable. Jackie Coogan, 5 feet 5 inches. He started as one of the most famous children in the world. In The Kid, Jackie Coogan stood beside Charlie Chaplin and instantly captured audiences with something rare, authentic emotion. But as he grew older, something changed. Not his talent, his image, because he never grew into the kind of towering figure Hollywood preferred. At around 5'5", the Coogan found himself in a strange position, too recognizable to disappear, too small to fit traditional leading roles. So Hollywood adjusted. Instead of reshaping him into something he wasn't, they moved him into character roles. Quirky, offbeat, memorable. Eventually, he became Uncle Fester in The Addams Family, a role where his physicality became part of the charm. But underneath that transition is a quieter truth. Golden Age Hollywood didn't always reject short actors. Sometimes, it simply redefined them. Audie Murphy, 5 feet 5 inches. Before Hollywood ever noticed him, he had already made history. Audie Murphy wasn't just an actor. He was one of the most decorated American soldiers of World War II. His story alone sounds almost impossible. A young man, barely 5'5", standing against overwhelming odds, and surviving. When he entered Hollywood, that physical reality didn't change. He was smaller than the typical Western hero, smaller than the men he stood beside on screen. But something about him still worked. Not because of illusion, but because of truth. Directors didn't need to fake his strength. Audiences already knew it was real. And that created a different kind of presence. One that didn't rely on height or size. One that came from experience. In a strange way, Murphy became proof of something Hollywood rarely admitted. You don't need to look powerful when your story already is. Peter Lorre, 5 feet 5 inches. There are actors who fill a room with presence, and then there are actors who don't need the room at all. Peter Lorre belonged to the second kind. At around 5'5", he didn't fit the image of a dominant figure. But the moment the camera moved closer, none of that mattered. His face carried everything. The eyes, the voice, the quiet tension beneath every word. Hollywood didn't try to make him taller. They did something smarter. They moved the camera closer. In films like Casablanca, Lorre didn't need physical height to control a scene. His presence came from detail, from stillness, from the feeling that something was always happening beneath the surface. And audiences responded to that. Because fear, curiosity, unease, none of those things require size. They require focus. And Lorre understood that better than most. James Cagney, 5 feet 5 inches. If you only watched his films, you'd never guess it. James Cagney didn't feel small. He felt explosive. In gangster films like White Heat, his energy dominated every frame. Fast, sharp, unpredictable. The kind of presence that made other actors feel like they were reacting instead of acting. But physically, he stood at just 5'5". So how did Hollywood handle that? They didn't slow him down. They built around him. Cagney moved constantly. His performances were dynamic, rarely still long enough for the audience to focus on size. Directors used movement, framing, and pacing to amplify his intensity. And it worked, because dominance isn't always about height. Sometimes, it's about momentum. And once Cagney was in motion, nothing else mattered. Alan Ladd, 5 feet 5 inches. This is where the illusion becomes obvious. Because Alan Ladd wasn't just short. He was carefully engineered to not look short. Often listed at 5'6", many insiders believed he was closer to 5'5", or even slightly below. And unlike others on this list, the Hollywood didn't embrace it. They hid it. In film after film, Ladd was placed on raised platforms, positioned in trenches, paired with shorter actresses. Even camera angles were designed to shoot upward, giving him artificial height and authority. And if you look closely, you can still see it. Moments where the framing feels slightly off, where co-stars stand at unusual distances, where scenes are blocked in ways that feel controlled. Because they were. Ladd was a leading man, and leading men, at the time, weren't supposed to be small. So Hollywood didn't change the standard. They changed reality. Frank McHugh, 5 feet 6 inches. He was never the tallest man in the room, but somehow, he was always in it. Frank McHugh didn't look like a star. He didn't fit the image Hollywood carefully built for leading men. At around 5'6", he stood noticeably shorter than many of the actors around him. And yet, he appeared in film after film, scene after scene, working alongside some of the biggest names of the Golden Age. Not as the hero, not as the dominant figure, but as something just as important: presence. McHugh became one of Hollywood's most reliable character actors. The friend, the sidekick, the observer, the man who existed inside the story without needing to control it. And because of that, he was everywhere. But here's what makes him the perfect ending to this list. Hollywood didn't try to turn him into something he wasn't. They didn't hide his height. They didn't build illusions around him. They used him exactly as he was. And that reveals something deeper about the entire system. Not every actor needed to be made larger than life. Some were valuable precisely because they weren't. Because while leading men were being lifted on boxes, framed through angles, carefully constructed to appear bigger, actors like McHugh stood exactly where they were. And stayed there. Consistently, quietly, reliably. Which leads to a final realization. Hollywood didn't just create stars. It created balance. And sometimes, the smallest figures were the ones holding everything together. Edward G. Robinson, 5 feet 6 inches. Power doesn't always arrive the way you expect it to. Edward G. Robinson didn't look like the traditional Hollywood threat. He wasn't tall. He wasn't physically imposing. Standing at around 5'6", he lacked the towering presence studios usually preferred for dominant roles. And yet, when he spoke, everything shifted. In Little Caesar, Robinson didn't need size to command attention. His voice carried authority. His timing created tension. Every word felt deliberate, controlled, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with physical strength. Hollywood noticed something important here. Audiences weren't just responding to appearance. They were responding to presence. So instead of hiding Robinson's height, directors leaned into contrast. They placed him among taller men, but made sure he was the one controlling the moment. That contrast did something unexpected. It made his dominance feel earned, not given. Because when someone smaller controls a room full of bigger men, it feels different, more calculated, more dangerous. And that's exactly what Robinson delivered. Burgess Meredith, 5 feet 6 inches. Some actors disappear into roles. Burgess Meredith did something more subtle. He blended into them. At around 5'6", Meredith didn't carry the physical traits of a leading man. He wasn't built to dominate scenes through stature or presence. And in many ways, that became his greatest advantage. Because Hollywood didn't expect him to lead, which meant audiences didn't either. And that lowered expectations in a way that made his performances feel unpredictable. In projects like The Twilight Zone, Meredith often played characters who felt overlooked, underestimated, or quietly isolated. His physical presence reinforced that feeling. He looked like someone the world might ignore, until it didn't. Because when the story shifted, when tension built, Meredith had a way of pulling attention back toward himself. Not loudly, not dramatically, but gradually, almost invisibly. That's the kind of control most actors never achieve. He didn't need to appear larger than life. He needed to feel real enough that when something changed, you noticed. Charlie Chaplin, 5 feet 5 inches. Before sound, before dialogue, before Hollywood fully understood storytelling, there was movement. And no one understood movement better than Charlie Chaplin. At 5'5", Chaplin didn't fit the image of a traditional hero. But he didn't try to. Instead, he created something entirely new, a character built around contrast, small body, big emotion. The tramp wasn't powerful. He wasn't dominant. He wasn't even successful in the traditional sense. But audiences connected with him in a way that larger, more perfect characters couldn't replicate. Because he felt human, his size played a role in that. It made him look vulnerable, outmatched, like someone constantly navigating a world slightly too big for him. And that visual imbalance created empathy before he even did anything. But here's where it becomes interesting. Chaplin didn't hide his height. He built his entire identity around it. Every movement, every stumble, every moment of quiet resilience. It all worked because of that physical reality, not in spite of it. While other actors needed tricks to appear larger, Chaplin became unforgettable by staying exactly as he was. Peter Sellers, 5 feet 5 inches. Transformation can hide a lot of things. Peter Sellers built his career on becoming someone else, again and again. Different voices, different personalities, different identities layered over the same physical frame. At around 5'5", he wasn't physically imposing. But that never limited him. Because he rarely appeared as himself long enough for it to matter. Each role shifted perception. Each performance redirected attention. And that made his size almost invisible. While other actors relied on camera tricks to appear larger, Sellers did something more subtle. He transformed so completely that the audience stopped looking at the body altogether. They focused on the character, the behavior, the unpredictability. In one film, he could be controlled and precise. In another, chaotic and unrecognizable. That constant reinvention created a different kind of presence, one that didn't depend on physical dominance. Which is what makes him stand out on this list. Not because he overcame his height, but because he erased the need for it entirely. Mel Blanc, 5 feet 5 inches. You heard him long before you ever saw him. And Mel Blanc wasn't just an actor. He was hundreds of characters. Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Porky Pig. Voices that defined an entire era of animation. At around 5'5", Blanc didn't fit the traditional image of a Hollywood performer. But, unlike others, he didn't need to. His presence existed entirely through sound. And that changes everything. Because when your identity is built on voice, size becomes irrelevant. Hollywood didn't need to elevate him with platforms or camera tricks. He operated in a space where physical appearance simply didn't matter. And yet, his influence was everywhere, which makes him one of the most powerful examples on this list. Because he proves something the industry rarely admits. Sometimes the most dominant presence is the one you never see. Lou Costello, 5 feet 5 inches. Comedy has its own kind of physics. McHugh Costello understood that better than most. At around 5'5", he stood noticeably shorter than his partner Bud Abbott. And instead of hiding that difference, their act was built around it. Control versus chaos. Calm versus confusion. Abbott played straight. Costello reacted, overreacted, collapsed into panic and frustration in ways that felt completely unpredictable. And his size amplified that. It made him feel more vulnerable, more expressive, more reactive to everything happening around him. But that vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was timing. Because every stumble, every outburst, every moment of confusion landed harder when it felt real. Hollywood didn't try to reshape Costello into a leading man. They let him be exactly what he was. And that authenticity turned him into one of the most recognizable comedic figures of the era. Claude Rains, 5 feet 6 inches. Some actors don't need to be seen to dominate a scene. Claude Rains proved that, literally. Standing around 5'6", Rains didn't fit the physical image of a commanding Hollywood figure. He wasn't tall, he wasn't physically imposing, and yet he consistently played characters who controlled entire narratives. In Casablanca, as Captain Renault, he never raises his voice, never forces authority, and still, he owns every moment he's in. But his most revealing role came earlier. The Invisible Man. A performance where the audience couldn't even see him. No physical presence, no height advantage, nothing visual to rely on, just voice, timing, control. And it worked, because Rains understood something many actors didn't. Power isn't visual, it's psychological. Hollywood didn't need to hide his height with extreme tricks or forced staging. Instead, they leaned into what made him effective. His ability to command attention without ever demanding it. Placed beside taller actors, he didn't try to compete physically. He redirected focus. Through dialogue, through rhythm, through presence that felt almost effortless. And that's what makes him different from others on this list. While many actors needed illusion to appear larger, Claude Rains proved something far more unsettling. You don't even need to be seen to completely control the screen. Mickey Rooney, 5 feet 2 inches. And then there's Mickey Rooney. Because unlike everyone else on this list, he didn't hide it. At 5'2", Rooney wasn't just short for a leading man. Well, he was dramatically shorter than almost everyone around him. In an industry quietly built around image, proportion, and visual dominance, he didn't fit the model at all. And yet, he became one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. Not briefly, not accidentally, consistently. From the late 1930s into the early 1940s, Rooney was one of the top box office draws in the entire industry, which creates a question Hollywood never fully answered. Why did it work? Because Rooney didn't try to compete on physical presence. He overwhelmed the screen in a completely different way. Energy, speed, emotion. He moved faster, spoke faster, reacted faster. His performances filled the frame so completely that there was no space left to notice size. And even when studios tried to manage perception, careful framing, controlled staging, it never defined him the way it did others. Because Rooney didn't rely on illusion, he replaced it. While Hollywood was busy trying to make actors appear larger than life, Rooney proved something unexpected. You don't need to be big to completely take over the screen. They weren't towering figures, they were carefully framed ones. Behind every iconic performance was a hidden layer of control. Angles, platforms, illusions designed to protect an image audiences never questioned. But now you've seen it. And once you notice the trick, Hollywood feels different. Because sometimes the biggest legends were never as big as they seemed.